It's Mo. It is January 5th, and I finished 2 books in January. I just did the end of my December wrap-up, so it's time to start my January wrap-up. I do vlog-style reading wrap-ups, so I try to talk about the books as close to when I finish them as I can and string them together in vlog-style clips. I try to talk for only about 5 minutes for each book. I try to tell you a little bit about the book, what I thought of it, and if I recommend it. So, the first book that I completed in January of 2025, how is that possible, is We Took to the Woods by Louise Dickenson Rich. This is a nonfiction book that was written in the 40s about Rich's time meeting her husband and moving into a remote house, a remote camp in the middle of the Maine woods. So they have a couple of acres, but they butt right up against a preserved woodland, also a logging company's woodland. Louise Dickenson Rich goes from being like a normal city girl, town girl, to living in this incredibly remote, hard place, going from living a normal life in the 1940s to living an extremely self-sustainable life in the middle of the woods. I love books like this. I love The Good Life by Scott and Helen Nearing. I haven't read the second book of those yet. I love Woodswoman by Anne LaBastille. I love books about people forging their own life, becoming the people that they want to become by removing themselves from society, learning to live a sustainable lifestyle, whether they're calling it that or not, whether they are thinking that they're living a sustainable life or not. These books are all about how you can live without society's influence for the most part. Obviously, all of these people do still have to follow some constraints of normal society and of American society. They do have to make money in some way, but they're also able to do things like barter for the things that they need where they live. They're able to grow their own food, they're able to fix their own houses, they're able to sew their own clothes and things like that. So I love stories like this, and this was a great one. Rich's voice is very funny and very like wry and very sarcastic, which I really liked. Some of the books that I've written are kind of like that, some are not at all. She just has a particularly strong ethereal voice that leans that way. I think all the people have a strong voice, but she is like almost your typical like news person of the 1940s, like page boy hat, like burr, 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 like making little quips, using funny idioms of the day and funny references of the day, which some of them I got, some of them I didn't. Obviously, I'm not from the 1940s, so some of them went over my head, but I really enjoyed reading her writing and seeing her outlook on life. And it's interesting because this is the first of these that I've read that takes place during the war, during World War II. She very lightly touches on the war and how that affects them out there and why they are not in the war, why they're not participating in the war, but what they are doing to some extent to the war effort or towards the war effort. So this one was a really interesting one. If you're interested in books like these, highly recommend. The next book that I finished in January, I just read this morning, and that is Taproot, a story about a gardener and a ghost. This is one of the first books that I've picked up in 2025, and this is the first of those books that I've read, and this is just a really short graphic novel. It seems pretty obvious that this was a webcomic at one point, I think. Not necessarily because of the way that it's drawn, but because of the kind of disconnected nature of the story. This story follows Blue and, oh, I forget his name, Hamel. Blue is a ghost and Hamel is a gardener. So Hamel can see ghosts, he meets Blue, and Blue encourages him to follow his dream and become a gardener. And this is just a little slice of life story when Blue and Hamel's lifestyle that they've created and their relationship is threatened. So this one was really sweet, really good. Definitely made me tear up a little bit at the end. I love queer graphic novels, so that was why I wanted to pick this one up. I don't think I'd ever heard of it, or maybe I've heard of it, but I didn't have it on my want to read list, but I saw it in a little free library and I just wanted to get it. So I'm really glad that I did. I read it in probably a half an hour, and it was super fun, and I can't wait to put it with my collection, which is slowly growing, of queer graphic novels. This is an adult novel, but it could definitely be aimed at a young adult audience. These two characters are adult, but if you're interested in books like these, it's really pretty. The illustrations are really nice. The story is cute, a little disjointed, but overall a fun read. And those are the first two books that I read in January, so when I read some more, I will let you know. It is January 10th, and I have read 4 more books in January so far. I finished Night of the Living Rez by Morgan Talty. This was my TBR spin book for one of my 2024 TBR spins. I'm still trying to catch up on those. This is a collection of short stories, and I talk more about my thoughts of it in that TBR spin vlog, so I will leave that listed down below. But this is a collection of stories that was gathered from all different places that Talty wrote and then appeared in different publications and then were combined here. Now, personally, I think that this should have been made into a novel instead of a collection of short stories, because it all follows one person, David, or D, as he's known when he grows up, and it's all about his life living on the reservation. It's about his relationship with his mother, it's about his relationship with his father, with various girlfriends, with various best friends, and it follows Dee's life from when his mother and his father split up and his mother and he move back to the reservation and move in partially with one of his mother's boyfriends. His sister comes in and out of their lives, his grandmother comes in and out of their lives, and this is all about kind of the hardships of living on the reservation and the hardships of being both Indian and white, and how he's not fully accepted by people on the reservation sometimes, how he's definitely considered a person of color by white people, how he falls into smoking and eventually drugs, and then is on methadone for most of his adult life within these stories. It does jump around in time. Loosely, these short stories are one short story of when he was young and then one when he's old, but a couple of times they go like old or young. And I don't know, I just feel like with a little bit of work, even like another short story or a couple of short pages in between some of these stories, they could have been joined into a novel. It obviously follows all the same people. It obviously tells David's story. I don't think it would have needed much more padding out to become a novel, and I think it would have been more effective as a novel. There's a ton of tragedy, a ton of addiction, a ton of abuse in this book, and I think it depicts, maybe not auto-fiction of Talty's life, but at very least some of Talty's experiences living on a reservation in Maine. One of my favorite parts of this book is that one of the stories mentions Smoke Signals, which was a movie in the 90s about two boys living on a reservation who take kind of a road trip together, and it's one of my all-time favorite movies. I love that movie. I didn't realize that it was based on a Sherman Alexie story, and I actually have that book, which is so super exciting. And then also I didn't realize that he wrote the screenplay, and I think it was a big deal in the 90s because it was one of the first independent films that got a lot of acclaim that was revolving all around Native American life as it is at that time, and Native American people. It featured Native American actors for real, and it also featured Native American crew and cast and director and all sorts of things like that. So it got a lot of acclaim at the time for that, but it also is just a really notable movie in my mind, and in my childhood it was one that I watched a lot when I was a teenager, and I love, and they reference in this, which I absolutely love. So I would definitely highly recommend Night of the Living Rez. Be warned that even though it's called Night of the Living Rez, which doesn't make any sense at all because it doesn't have any reference in any of the stories, it is not a horror. It is just slice of life coming of age stories of David. So I definitely highly recommend it. I think it's a great addition to the books that are coming out recently and have come out in the last 30 or so years depicting life on Native American reservations. So I really enjoyed it, and I can't wait to read Talty's next novel, which came out in 2024 or 2025. The next book that I finished in January was How to Live Safely in a Science Fictional Universe by Charles Yu. I read Interior Chinatown by Charles Yu, and I really, really loved it. And this is similar in that it is the story of a Chinese American man and how he's dealing with life, his relationship with his parents who are immigrants, and how he is like a second generation immigrant, or however they call that. And it takes place in like a framing narrative of something weird. So in Interior Chinatown, it's all told in script form, and it's like they're shooting a movie or a TV show and you're reading the script for that, but it breaks the fourth wall a lot. And in How to Live Safely, it is a framing narrative of a science fiction time travel. So the main character in this is living in a time machine, and it's just kind of reflecting on and talking about his relationship with his dad who went missing and who he's trying to find, and how he kind of geared his whole life towards trying to reconcile that relationship and what that's meant for him over time. So he is living in this time machine, working for the time machine company, going and helping people whose time machines are broken or who are in the wrong place in time, but he's also using his time there to escape his life and to ignore his life and ignore his relationships, but also kind of thinking about and dealing with his relationships and ultimately like trying to find his dad who has been lost in time. Again, a lot of like wink, wink, nod, nod to the reader. There's a lot of breaking the fourth wall. There's a little bit of a book within this one. And just like Interior Chinatown, the kind of arrogant, obnoxious, ethereal voice is very strong with this one, and that's also kind of how the main character is. So I think you have to be okay with that voice to enjoy Charles Yu's books. And I think that these books are probably best read physically or at least in tandem. I know my friend recently tried to read Interior Chinatown on audio and couldn't get through it, and I think that that one 100% needs to be read physically, at least in part. And this one, I think it helped to have the physical book as well, because like I said, there is a book within a book, and there's some like visual humor in this and visual nods that you don't really get 100% with the audiobook. So I did enjoy this one. I definitely liked Interior Chinatown more, but this one was a fun time. If you like meta books, if you like time travel books, this reminded me a lot of like Red Shirts by John Scalzi, those kind of books that play with science fiction tropes, those books that play with the idea of science fiction being reality. I think this is a good one. The next book that I finished in January was Decline and Fall by Evelyn Waugh. This was another TBR spin book, and this one I just flew through. Evelyn Waugh is a queer English author who was writing in the early 1900s. This book was written in 1928, and this is his first published novel, I believe. Decline and Fall follows the decline and fall of our main character, Paul, who, while he's at Oxford, has a wild and raucous night and is accused of indecent exposure because he streaked on campus, and he's sent down or expelled from college. And that starts a whole kind of snowball effect of Paul's life where he has to get a job, his inheritance is taken away by his uncle, he starts working at a school that's not very good, he meets a young student, falls in love with his mother, is sent to prison, people around him fake their own deaths, people around him are liars and thieves, and all sorts of weird things happen. And this is definitely a parody of upper class British life, and also a satire of like a typical Oxford student's life and how their lives progress and kind of how the upper crust of English society live. And it's very, very silly, and it's very, very funny. It made me laugh out loud at parts, and it just follows the decline and fall, like I said, of this person's life and how it becomes more and more ridiculous, like, the further the book goes. So you never know what to expect. This is another book, actually, that does talk direct to readers sometimes and kind of says, like, I bet you want to know what's going on with this, which is pretty cute. I really just thought it was really funny and really silly. I like this edition. I did read this one on audio, but this physical edition does have little illustrations in it, which I think is really cute. I have a couple of these editions for Evelyn Waugh books, and I think they're really nice. So, like I said, if you want to see more of my thoughts on this one, you can go ahead and watch that TBR Spin video when it comes out, but I really enjoyed this one. The next book that I read in January is If You Kept a Record of Sins by Andrea Bajani. Bajani is an Italian author, and this story is about a young man who is going to Romania to bury his mother who has recently died. So he had a very tumultuous relationship with his mother, a very loving and close relationship when he was very young, and then his mother invented a exercise or weight loss device that kind of took over her whole world, and eventually she leaves both her son and her husband and moves to Romania to work in her company revolving around this weight loss device. So it tells of kind of how he and his mother's relationship was very close in the beginning, but as she moved away from the family and became more obsessed with her work and with other people in her life, their relationship became strained, and then how he hadn't seen her for many years before her death. It's mostly just a reflection on our main character's relationship with his mother and how his life might have been different, or how the relationship that he had with his mother led to the life that he has now. So I thought this was really interesting. It was really short. I read this one on audio. I love these editions. I don't know what press this is. Archipelago Books. And every book I've read so far from these are amazing. They are kind of, in my mind, similar to NYRB books, where they are classics or forgotten classics or modern books that are not well known. Every one that I've read, like I said, is so great, and I think they're so well curated. This book was actually written in 2021, so it's definitely not a classic, and then the English translation was also in 2021. This book was translated from the Italian, and I really enjoyed this one. I was hesitant to go in with it because I thought it was going to be a child main character, but I really liked the framing device of having it be a story that our main character is reminiscing on. So although we hear some of his childhood thoughts, it's not like a child main narrator. If you like coming of age stories, if you like mother-son relationships, I would definitely highly recommend this. And I would like to read more by this author. I don't know what other works he's done, if any, or if any were translated. Those are all the books that I've read so far in January, and when I read some more, I'll let you know. Editing Mo here, if you couldn't tell, to say that I don't know how I skipped this book. This was the first book that I read in January for the Buzz Cover-a-thon, or the Buzzword Cover Reading Challenge. I knew right away that I wanted to read this one. I got this one a few years ago at a library sale, and this is The Legacy of Lost Things by Aida Zilelian. The Legacy of Lost Things is about Araxi, who is the daughter of an Armenian American family living in New York, and this book starts when she's been missing. So this book follows through different chapters the members of her family, her father, her mother, and her younger sister, and then we do get chapters from Araxia herself, so we do know where she is and what's happened to her, but mostly this book is about Araxia's family, her parents growing up, how her family got together, her mother's relationship with a former lover and the love of her life, and how that affected her relationship with her husband, how that continues to affect their lives. This is definitely one of those stories where we see each member's reaction to this tragedy, to this event of Araxi leaving and of her absence, and it makes each person reflect on what's going on. And then we also see Araxi and her friend, what is happening in their lives while Araxi's family is back home in Queens. I think it was Queens. Was it Queens or Brooklyn? Dealing with the loss of Araxi. I thought that this was a pretty bad book, pretty badly written. This is by Bleeding Heart Publications, which is definitely like an indie press. And I think this book definitely needed editing for context and also just for grammar and things like that. And I think that it felt very sophomoric or new or young in its writing style. But I ended up enjoying the story, and I think there were some interesting twists and turns in this one, some interesting character development. I just think that like it wasn't a very well executed book, and this writer probably needed more time to hone their craft. But I think the story itself was interesting. With more work, could have been much better. I think some of the reveals and the character development and the paths that these different characters take both separately and together would have benefited from this writer honing their skills, honing their craft a little bit more. But overall, I enjoyed it. Will I remember a lot of it? No. Would I try this author again? Yes. So if you're interested in kind of coming of age stories, runaway stories, family dynamics, give it a try, but know that it's not the best written book. Now back to the other books that I read in January. It is January 22nd, and I have finished quite a few more books in January. The next book that I finished was Thousand Cranes by Yasunari Kawabata. This is a Japanese modern classic about a young man whose parents have died, and he is living alone in the family house with just his servants when his father's mistress, one of his father's mistress, who used to live with them and who used to perform tea ceremonies for them, calls him to a tea ceremony that she now performs. He doesn't usually go to these. She's often asked him to come, but he doesn't really like her and he doesn't really respect her, and he thinks she's pretty like meddling. Not to mention she is the mistress that his father kind of threw over for a different mistress. But she says that there's a young woman there that he needs to meet to potentially marry, so he decides to go to this tea ceremony. When he gets there, he has to deal with the mistress, and then the other one of his father's mistresses, Mrs. Ota, shows up at this tea ceremony as well, and that just complicates his whole life. And this story is about his relationship with those two women, as well as the young woman that he could potentially marry, as well as Mrs. Ota's daughter. It was really interesting. I'm super glad I read it. I really like Yasunari Kawabata's writing. These are not his most famous works, the works that I have read, but I really think they're very, very interesting. Written in the early 1900s. This one was written a little bit later, I think in 1958. Show you a slice of Japanese culture and Japanese life at this time. This one was interesting too because it does mention things like wearing Western dress and the idea of like Westernization of Japanese culture. If you would like to hear more of my thoughts on this, I did read this for the TBR Spin. It was my last TBR Spin book in 2024. So I did a whole vlog on that and my other TBR Spin book. Did I already talk about it here? The next book that I finished in January is What Lies in the Woods by Kate Alice Marshall. This is the first Kate Alice Marshall book that I read, and I read that for Winterween. And I read it because although I don't have a physical copy on me, I do have a physical copy. So I'm still trying to read books off of my TBR, and this one I lent to a friend. So in a way, I wanted to read it to see if I wanted the physical copy back or if I didn't need the physical copy back. And my conclusion is that I thought this thriller was like totally fine. It was okay, but I definitely don't need it back. So it feels like not only is it off my TBR, but it's basically unhauled as well. Like I already don't remember a lot of this. What Lies in the Woods follows Naomi, who is one of three best friends who share a traumatic act in their childhood. Naomi is living her life, trying to get her life together. She is a wedding photographer. She's really good at that, but she's still connected to her hometown where this tragedy occurred by her two best friends who both still live there. One of her best friends still lives with her parents because she is like mentally unstable and has a lot of mental issues, has tried to commit suicide before, and the other best friend, who was kind of the leader of their little group, lives there with a thriving business and her daughter. Naomi kind of is the person who got away from their small town, but she has not necessarily gotten away from the traumatic events in her past. Naomi was stabbed multiple times and she does not remember the events of what happened exactly, but between the three girls, they were able to put this killer away in jail. So it's about Naomi trying to reconcile herself and her current life with her past, trying to understand her friends and her family who she doesn't get along with. She's trying to like reconcile with her hometown and the events that happen there. It's a very standard mystery thriller premise. Young girl, traumatic past, goes back home, has to figure out whether what she thought had happened had actually happened, right? I liked Kate Alice Marshall's writing. I liked some of the individual character development of these three girls' relationship. That sounds weird. I liked the character development of these three girls' relationships and the way that they played together when they were young and the way that they treated each other was interesting. Nothing groundbreaking or super innovative in this book, but there were certain little details like a game that they used to play called the Goddess Game, which made this book a lot more interesting and gave it a lot more intrigue than it would have had without it. But it was definitely the kind of thriller that you know what's going to happen. It was definitely the kind of thriller where you were like, oh, it's the one guy. Oh, no, that's a red herring. Oh, it's the other person. No, that's a red herring. Oh, it's what I thought it was in the beginning. And that's the end. Like, they give you enough red herrings that you were like, maybe I was wrong, even though I sussed it out from the beginning. But then you weren't wrong. You were right. The first thing you thought it was what you thought it was. And I definitely thought this one was way too long. Like, it could have been cut down a little bit, and there was definitely some parts that were slow. But overall, it followed like a very traditional thriller path and didn't really do anything super exciting. That being said, if you like thrillers and you want to read another one of those, and you don't mind reading thrillers that are all basically the same, which I'll talk about another one of those in a minute, then I think this was a totally fine, fun thriller. I liked the characters. I liked Naomi and some of the other characters involved. I think Kate Alice Marshall did a good job of like giving you that feeling of like, I don't trust that person even though they're supposedly good or whatever. I mean, I already basically forgot what this one was about and I didn't read it that long ago. So there's that. Nothing bad necessarily to say about it except that it was boring and obvious. Pretty standard. But if you like thrillers like that, then I would definitely recommend this one. The next book that I finished in January is Excellent Women by Barbara Pym. This is the first Barbara Pym that I read. I read it because of Books and Lala's Buzz Coverathon, which is for January the recurring pattern on a cover, which is also why I read The Legacy of Lost Things. Excellent Women is about Mildred, who is a vicar's daughter. When her parents passed away, she moved to her own small apartment. She really likes it, but she still is an excellent woman, which is in English vernacular or in British vernacular, kind of a woman who is not married, who doesn't have kids, who doesn't do in society what they're supposed to do, but they're still excellent women. Like, they still do charities, they still volunteer, they still help people out, they still are productive members of society, even though they're not like what a woman should be necessarily. Mildred helps out at the vicarage. She's friends with the vicar and the vicar's sister. She has other friends in town. She works at a crisis center. She is by all means an excellent woman, but she's a little bit of a Emma in that she sees things that she could be doing behind the scenes to help people. So she meets various people and she kind of tries to pull some strings to get people together. And when a young couple move in next door and they're a little bit volatile, she sees this as a good opportunity to get involved in their lives and help them along. So these people are definitely modern. They're not what she's used to. The husband is very handsome. The wife is very independent. And she kind of gets wrapped up in this world of the modern versus the kind of old-timey that she's used to, and sees the benefits of both and how they both can benefit from each other and how she can kind of bridge that gap. So it's a little bit of like a, what's the word, novel of man manners. It's a little bit just about society and the changes that are happening in society. It's a little bit of like an Emma story where she's kind of fixing things behind the scenes and making things up. But she's also definitely like recognizing herself and coming to her own and seeing how for all these years people thought she was kind of a lost cause, that she's an old spinster, but how she prefers to live that way. And when she does start getting attention from various young people or various men, what she really finds is that she's totally happy being herself and being self-sufficient. So this one was really fun, very funny, lots of British humor, obviously. It was written in the 50s, so it definitely is, you know, an older, modern, classic type of book, but I definitely love books like this one, and Barbara Pym seems like another writer that I will really enjoy reading from. Similar to Evelyn Waugh, similar to some of the other British writers that I really like, these quiet novels about people's lives and people being introspective and learning about themselves are something that I really, really enjoy. So I'm glad to have read that one. I would definitely highly recommend if you're interested in novels like that, especially if you're interested in life in England around that time, or if you like that kind of vibe, that feeling of life in England around that time. The next book that I finished in January is The Only One Left by Riley Sager. This is the last Riley Sager that I own, but not the last one that I have to read. This is the 5th Riley Sager book that I have read. I have read The Only One Left, The House Across the Lake, Home Before Dark, Final Girls, and Survive the Night. I read this for Winterween, but I also read it for a Savage Prompt, so you will see a whole vlog coming out on wrapping up my 2024 Savage Prompts. So if you want to know more about my thoughts on this one, definitely go there. And if you want to see my rating for all the Riley Sagers that I've read, how I would tier rank them, go there as well. The Only One Left is set in the 80s, which I think is interesting. I don't think that most of his books are historical fictions, but this one is definitely a historical fiction set in the 80s in Maine, and it follows Kit McDear, who is a carer. She's like a home health aide. She is not a nurse, but she's been working for the same home health aide company for 12 years when something happens, a tragedy happens, and a patient that she is caring for dies. People think that either she killed the patient or it's just through her neglect. So Kit is put on leave, and when she finally comes back, when no charges are brought against her, her reputation is fairly ruined, and the owner of the care company really doesn't want her to stay on, but Kit has nothing else that she can do. She needs the job, so her boss sends her to Hope's End, which is a huge manor house in the rich part of town, right on the cliffs of Maine. When Kit gets there, she realizes why this is not a great job, because it's caring for Lenore Hope, who supposedly murdered her whole family when she was young. So it's a little bit of like an homage to We Have Always Lived in the Castle. It's definitely a story that could lead you to the supernatural. Are there ghosts? Are there things going on? And Kit is nervous because all her life growing up she's heard the rhyme, she's heard the bad things that people say about Lenore Hope, and she sees it as a form of punishment for her, who people often think of as a murderer, to be having to take care of someone who everyone thinks is a murderer. Lenore Hope is completely paralyzed in almost all of her body. She can't speak, she can't use any of her body parts on her own except for her left hand. Kit kind of starts to reevaluate what people are saying about Lenore Hope. Maybe Kit is wrong in assuming that Lenore Hope is a murderer the way people are wrong about Kit. And so Kit goes kind of on a mission to discover the truth about what happened at Hope's End way back in the day. So like I was saying about What Lies in the Woods, this is a very, very obvious one. Like, you pretty much know right away from the beginning most of what's going to happen. And I think the really bad thing about this book is that it's so long. Like, a lot of Riley Sager's books are pretty short, and I think that that works better for his style, because yes, he builds suspense, and yes, he makes the reader question what they think is going on, like I was saying about What Lies in the Woods. It's the kind of thing where you're like, oh, I think this is what happened, this is what happened, and this is what happened, and then he puts in a lot of red herrings to make you say, oh, well, okay, I could see it being that person instead, but then in the end it is exactly what you thought. So that's how the progression of this book as well, but it doesn't happen until, like, even all of that, it takes you at least 2/3 of the book, if not 3/4 of the book, to even get to the place where you're seeing red herrings. There's so much repetitiveness. There's so much that could have been cut out of this to make it more exciting, because by the time that you get to some of the twists and turns and some of the red herrings, you're just so bored. You're like, okay, but I read 300 pages of this already. Okay, whatever. Like, you just don't care about what ends up happening. So I think that that is a real problem. I also think that Riley Sager's book within a book idea, which was the same with Home Before Dark, is just kind of boring and not done in a great way, because it just ends up being very repetitive, and it just ends up telling you information that you already know more than one time. Luckily, this is not one chapter of Kit, one chapter of the book within the book. It only happens like every 4 or 5 chapters, and it's only a very small chapter where we see that. It just takes you out of the story, and you're not really, I don't know, you're not discovering things with Kit. You feel so removed from her point of view, and you feel so removed from the idea of her shock and awe and excitement. By the time you get through the chapters that are typed, it kills the suspense of it in this particular one. And then at the very end, there's all these twists and turns, and then at the very, very end, there's like one more twist, and felt just a little bit forced. This one is definitely not one of my favorite Riley Sagers. I don't know why I keep reading Riley Sager necessarily, because I don't love his work, but his books are just very fast. Even though this one took me a long time, even though this one was really, really slow, like, it still felt like it went kind of fast. The Complete Collected Poems of Maya Angelou. So I've been reading this for a couple of months now. It's very, very large, and it has all of her poetry collections collected in this one collection. There's the titles of the different books in here, the last of which being one that I've already read, that I read, I think at the beginning of last year, which is I Shall Not Be Moved. So this one was an interesting one. It was interesting to read her work in order. I don't usually read poetry collections in order. I usually skip around, but because this was in chronological order of when the collections came out, I thought it was interesting to read them and see, like, kind of the changing ideas that she had in here, and maybe some of the things that had worked for her in the past that she kind of brought back, like a repetitive stanza of words like I Shall Not Be Moved. Overall, a good book. Obviously, Maya Angelou is amazing. I'm happy to have read this big collection work of poetry. Now, I don't know if this is all her poems, or only up to the point which this is written, so I would definitely read more of her poetry, and I guess I am going to have to go back at some point and read, like, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. This was published in 1994, so there might be some more work out there. I don't know when Maya Angelou passed away. I did read I Know Why the Caged Bird Sing in high school, and I remember really not liking it, but I think because the subject matter was so horrible, I probably didn't like it for having to read that in school. The last book that I've read so far in January is Days at the Murasaki Bookshop by Satoshi Yahisawa. This is a Japanese translated work that got a lot of acclaim when it was first published in Japan in 2010, and it was recently translated to English, and it is about a young woman who loses her boyfriend of several years when she finds out that he's been seeing another woman this whole time and they're going to get married. But he's such a cad, he's a terrible person, and he's like, oh, it's fine, we can just still keep seeing each other, but we have to, like, cool it till after the wedding. And our main character, Takako, is really shocked by this. She's really upset because she thought they were on a good path. She was in love with him, and this leads her to a deep depression. Because they work together, this also means that she feels like she has to quit her job, so she quits her job, and she's kind of languishing away when her uncle, her mother's brother, contacts her. He has a bookshop in a bookshop town in Japan, a little town with tons and tons of used bookshops, and he asked her to come and stay at the store. There's an apartment in the store, and it would really help him out if she could open the store some mornings. With little other option, and as her savings are dwindling, Takako decides to do this, and she's very hesitant because her uncle has always been a little bit weird. His wife left him, and she really doesn't know if she wants to associate herself with someone who's been so ostracized and someone who's so different, especially when she's feeling ostracized and different herself at the moment. She goes there, and of course, this is a heartwarming story. She starts to come out of her depression, and she starts to come out of her shell, and she starts to realize why her uncle asked her to live with him and help him at the bookstore, and she, starts to become her own person again. So the first part of this book is her doing that, and then the second part is kind of when she's on her feet again and she helps her uncle out in another way. This is definitely one of those very simple, very straightforward, but like with a message books of current Japanese literature. It's very obvious in its telling you what you should do in life and how you should act and why you should care about yourself and why you should care about the people around you. It's very sweet. It's very nice. I did enjoy it, and I plan on reading the sequel, which is More Days at the Morisaki Bookshop, which is also out translated on audio. I read this book on audio. I enjoyed the reader. It was fine. It was fun. It was easy to get through. It just doesn't have like the subtleties and the emotion and the deep character development that Japanese modern classics have. I don't know where they diverged, where Japanese literature diverged. I'm sure there's still Japanese literature, and there is, because I've read Convenience Store Woman and Diary of a Void, which I would say fall more in this category, even though with a very contemporary flair, with a very contemporary voice. And then why there's this like kind of more cutesy version. And then something that lies like right in between, I would say, would be something like The Guest Cat, where it's not quite as subtle as this and thought-provoking as this, but it's not quite as twee as this. It's interesting. I'm sure there are books like this in American too, but it's just a very striking contrast when you're reading Japanese literature. Super short, super easy to get through, very uplifting, heartwarming, nice. Even though there's difficult subject matter, even though there is suicidal ideation, even though there are trigger warnings in this, mostly it's a very uplifting story. So those are however many more books that I read in January, and when I read some more, I'll let you know. It is February, so I need to talk about the last books that I read in January, and the next book that I finished in January is The Color Purple by Alice Walker. I love this book. I was so intimidated by it, and I was so worried that this would be a hard book to read or that I wouldn't like it or whatever, but this book was amazing and I loved it. This book follows Selly, who we see when she is a young child, and let me tell you, the beginning of this book, really hard to get through because the first page, the first part, is her getting raped by her father. So it's very difficult to read in the beginning, and I was very worried seeing those first pages and those first entries being that tough. And her life doesn't get easier from there right away, but eventually we do see Selly coming into her own, growing up, learning, and experiencing joys as well as sorrows. This book is an epistolary novel, and it's all told with Selly writing to God. It's about Selly's relationship with her family, specifically her sister who she loves and tries to protect, and also the man that her father kind of marries her off to, and the family that he has. And then we find out the rest of Selly's story. So it starts when she's a young girl and goes through basically into her old age. And this ultimately is a book about queer joy in some ways. This is a book about survival and a book about resilience, and I loved it. So if you're nervous about reading this one because it is a classic, a modern classic, because it does have difficult things, definitely check trigger warnings. Definitely make sure that you're in the right headspace to read very hard stuff, especially abuse of children. But definitely pick this one up. I loved it. Alice Walker is becoming a favorite author of mine. I've read 3 books by her that I really, really enjoyed the majority of. One of them was a short story, so I didn't love everything about it. But this is my favorite of the ones that I've read. I know that Alice Walker is not an uncontroversial author because she is a TERF, which is a shame. It's so sad. It really mars my experience of reading, and it really makes me upset to know that, but I think this book and its messaging for queerness and queer joy can overcome even some of the author's views. So I would definitely highly, highly recommend The Color Purple. The next book that I finished in January was The Unexpected Mrs. Polifax by Dorothy Gilman. This is the first in the Mrs. Polifax series, and it follows Mrs. Polifax as she is an older woman living in New Brunswick, New Jersey, and being fed up with just doing the normal things that are expected of her. She's retired, her husband has died, and she does the things she's supposed to do, helps out at church, goes to different charities, does different things, but she is so bored, and she goes to her doctor who says, like, maybe try doing something that you've always wanted to do, but you never did when you were younger. So Mrs. Polifax decides that she is going to become a spy, and she marches right into Washington, D.C. to the CIA, and somehow becomes accepted as a courier and as a spy. And this is the story of her first mission and how that goes wrong, and how Mrs. Polifax thinks on her feet and uses her know-how and her practical nature to overcome the trials and tribulations of being a spy to end up being really good and qualified for what she does. So start of a fun series, cozy mystery series, definitely some dark stuff in here, definitely some bleak stuff, but also like some commentary on older people being able to do things, and not just because you're old can you not do things. Definitely some commentary on women and the idea of women's work, or how people, older people or women or any other group that you can think of, are stereotyped and pigeonholed into certain ways when obviously they are capable of other things, and people are capable, can do the unexpected. The Unexpected Mrs. Polifax. I also really like this one because it definitely shows that this was a trope and this was a fun time before the Thursday Murder Club. Like, I love the Thursday Murder Club, but I would say that this is very good, on par. Obviously more dated, definitely less English, but if you love the Thursday Murder Club, I would highly recommend the Mrs. Polifax series. The next book that I read in January was Adrift in Currents Clear and Clean by Shauna McGuire. This is the 10th in the Wayward Children series, and I read this book on audio. I got it from the library. I only own 2 of the Wayward Children series, but I really want to get all of them in hardcover. I really liked this 10th edition. We follow Nadia, who we have met in previous books and who we have seen kind of what happens to her at Eleanor West's School for Wayward Children, but this is her origin story. This is her portal world story. So we meet her when she is a tiny child, and she is Russian, and she gets adopted by an American family and moved from the orphanage where she felt very at home and knew what to expect and how to live and enjoyed life there, to Colorado with this family where she's kind of thrown into chaos, and then it's about her finding her door. This is an interesting one because Nadia only has one arm. She was only born with one arm, so there's a lot of commentary on disability rep and on disability in general, and there's also commentary on adoption and like the right reasons for adopting people, or the right way to adopt people, which I think was really interesting. And I think this sets us up for seeing more of what happens to Nadia after what we already know in the series. So if I had to guess, I would guess that we're going to revisit where Nadia ended up in our current timeline. So if you're unfamiliar with the Wayward Children series, It is a fantasy series about Eleanor West School for Wayward Children, which is a school where people who have gone to portal worlds go after they have to come back from those portal worlds. So think Narnia, think Alice in Wonderland, think the Goblin Market. These are children in some cases young adults, some cases young, some cases they seem young, but they are actually older than they are, who have been given a magical door, gone through this magical door, and then for whatever reason, that portal world has ejected them, and now they are back in the real world. So Eleanor West School is a safe space where they can go either while they're waiting, mostly while they're waiting for their doors to reopen, or how they can get integrated back into some sort of normal life. So I highly recommend the series. I read the whole series up to 10 in 2024. 10 came out in 2025, and I definitely plan on continuing this series for as long as it goes, which hopefully is a really long time. The next book that I read in January was The Inagami Curse by Seishi Yokomizo. This is a modern Japanese classic mystery novel, and it's unclear where it is exactly in the series, but this series follows Detective Kendaichi, who is a brilliant but quirky detective in Japan. He has a habit of being insightful and getting people to talk to him, getting people to tell them his story, but also of like obsessively scratching his head and wearing old, outdated clothing, and people don't necessarily take him seriously when they first meet him, but his powers of deduction are strong. In this installment, which is the first one that I've read, but it's somewhere in the middle of the series, Kendaichi travels to a mill town on the behest of a lawyer. So a lawyer contacts him and says, I have information, murder and mayhem and crime afoot. Can you please come and meet me? And Kendaichi goes there. But unfortunately, the day that he meets this lawyer, the lawyer is murdered. So Kendaichi doesn't really understand why he's there at first, but he stays, and he finds out that the leader of this town, the most affluent person, the person who created all the jobs, the person that the town revolves around, has died, and his will is going to be read, and there's a lot of mysterious and nefarious things going on along with this will reading. So Kendaichi meets the family, meets the lawyer who employed the lawyer who died and who is reading the will, meets various other characters, all revolved around the Ingami curse, and solves the mystery. So this one was really fun. I read this one physically, and it took me a while because it's kind of big, but it goes really fast. It has a lot of cool literary devices like, lists and the had I but known trope, or like we would see later that this was important trope, which was really fun, and it was just a generally fun and exciting mystery novel. So I definitely hope to find more of these and plan to read them all if I can. I know a new one just came out in 2025, so I'm excited about that. The last book that I read in January was Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, Informal Talks on Meditation and Practice by Shunryu Suzuki. And Shunryu Suzuki is a Zen master and a Buddhist master. This is his work on the cover. And this is several meditations, essays, and lectures that he gave. This was edited by Trudy Dickenson about Zen Buddhism, and specifically it starts out with the idea of Shoshin, which is partly why I read it, because it's connected to my name. So Shoshin is the idea in Zen Buddhism and in Buddhism of beginner's mind. So it means to come to every new situation with an open mind, with a beginner's mind, with a learner's mind. Suzuki talks about what that means in Zen practice and Buddhist practice, and how we can learn from that in the day to day. So I was super happy to read this one. I read this one on audio, which I really liked, but I think that this one would be a good one to return to certain chapters and read through them occasionally. Those were all the books that I read in January of 2025. I read 2 books for Winterween. So I read The Only One Left and What Lies in the Wood for Winterween. I did also read some short stories, but I didn't finish them. I read 3 books for the Savage Prompts, the 2024 Savage Prompts. I read Riley Sager, The Only One Left. I read Zen Mind, Beginner Mind, and I read Days at the Murakami Bookshop. I'm working on a video wrapping up all my 2024 Savage Prompts books, so you will definitely get to see that. I read 3 books for the TBR Spin 2024, so I wrapped up all my TBR Spin books, which you will also get to see a video on that. A video for Night of the Living Res is already out, and oh my god. And then I have a video coming out that has Decline and Fall and 1,000 Cranes. I read 2 books for Books and Lala's Buzz Cover Reading Challenge, a repeating pattern on the cover, so I went with like a very much just repeating patterns. I read The Legacy of Lost Things and Excellent Women. Oh, I also read Mrs. Polifax for Savage Prompts, so I read 4 books for Savage Prompts. I read 4 books for Japan in January: Days at the Murakami Bookshop, Zen Mind, Beginner Mind, 1,000 Cranes, and The Inugami Curse. And I think those are all the books that I read for different challenges and different readathons this month. Let me know what challenges and readathons that you participate in January. Do you always do the same ones? Do you do different ones? Let me know in the comments below. Also, let me know if you've read any of the books that I mentioned here and what you thought of them. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!